think this would happen at 7:30 this morning.
It's not quite like the end of March, is it?
Yes,
It was
I know.
amazing, when we woke up at 7, he was fine. 7:30, you get that flurry of powdered sugar, and it's over.
Powdered sugar got where I was in
Oh,
Vias.
really?
It was like sideways
Really?
and hammering the house. And
Right up on Grand Boulevard with powdered sugar.
I woke up and checked to see if I had an email from Mark saying, never mind.
Wait a minute.
Quick, and then,
Yeah,
and then I'll,
just
yeah.
give me the nod.
Okay.
Happy to do it.
Well, I guess it's about 10 or a minute after, so we'll go ahead and start, and people will probably be trickling in. I'll be watching if I need to put out more chairs. My name is Monica Caruso. I'm the county librarian here. Welcome to everyone. Before we get to Dr. Whyte, and Mark is going to say a few words too, just wanted to mention we've got National Library Week coming up, the week of April 3rd, and we've got we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the building, and I'll keep this little notice back here, but we had put some information on Facebook, and we've got it on our website calendar on the, if you take a look at that, you know, it's April 6th. So, yeah, I hope you'll come for that. We're gonna have a slideshow, right in this meeting room, we'll have some different activities, slideshow, cupcakes, etc. We also are gonna be kicking off our 5-year plan that week, and so we put some of the brochures back there if you'd like to grab one on your way out. Okay, and I'm going to, well, I wanted to also express our support for the Friends of the Library for the all the books that we've been ordering for this series, which Mark is going to talk a little bit about in a minute. So I'm going to introduce Mark Freed, and he is the director.
Stand over here so that for the radio time.
He is the, and you might have to correct me, he is the Director of Cultural Affairs for the town of Boone. Did I get that?
Yeah.
That's where,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, close enough, okay.
Close enough for banjo work. Hey everybody, welcome. Thank you for being here. This is so exciting. This is the first of our Boone Reads Together programs. We kicked this off in February, and hope everybody's had a chance to dive in a little bit to Dr. Whyte's book. Our next book, here's this full schedule if you want to see the full year's schedule and dive in with some other reads with us. The next one we'll be looking at Dr. Eric Flagg's Remembering Boone book, which is a lot of photographs, but also some great captions and great information and a nice introduction. And he'll be doing a presentation, something similar to this, on May 12th. So, and of course, this is all part of our Boone 150, which we're so happy to be celebrating our 150th anniversary in Boone this year. So there's some stickers back there. We have the website boone150.com if you want to keep up with some other events happening. There will be some coming up shortly on April 1st next weekend. There's lots of exciting things happening. Actually, all kinds of exciting things for our community happening next weekend. It will be the opening of the Farmers Market next weekend. It will be Banff Film Festival. There is an Appalachian Mount and Dance Symposium being put on by the Center for Appalachian Studies. There is the Build Fest with the Playhouse is happening. That's returning. So things are coming back rambunctiously from the years in hibernation, and we're so glad for that. Including another exciting event we're real happy about, the Boonerang Music and Arts Festival coming this June. There's some stickers and information back there. But of course, we're here to talk about older times and happy ancient tourism. And we're so happy to have Dr. Whyte here. He graciously lent us some pieces for an exhibit that we've had on display that
Which is in the library.
Mostly stayed attached. You're right. Some of them are heavier than we anticipated when we initially fixed them, but nothing's harmed.
We have a little display in the library.
There's a great display around the corner, so go step in and check that out before you go. But I'll turn things over to Monica, and she's going to introduce Dr. Whyte. But thanks for being here and helping us kick off this event. Yay for you!
Yay! Yeah, thank you, Mark. I just want to mention too that these books, we have read and share copies available out in the community. We've gotten about between 10 and 15 of those. So if you grab one of those, you can just grab it. I'll just say read and share, or read and return, I think it says, and then just bring it back to the library so we can get it out to other people. And then we have some copies that are cataloged as well that you could check out. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Tom Whyte. shift over in the spotlight there while the light's not, turn the light off. Okay, this is some great information, and I'm going to need to read this. So, Professor Dr. Thomas R. Whyte received his PhD in anthropology from the University of Tennessee in '88. He's been with App State since '89. He has published in both archaeological and biological journals. He's best known for his studies of animal remains from archaeological sites, but also has published studies involving ceramic and stone artifacts, cultural identity, and cultural change. His research has yielded one edited volume, over 40 articles and book chapters, 50 technical reports, and more than 50 professional papers. Please welcome Dr. Tom Whyte. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, and I'm really honored that some of you read my book, or maybe a chapter of my book, or maybe like me, just looked at the pictures. Since I wrote this book, I've gotten lots of invitations to give talks, and it's just been wonderful because that was my goal in writing this book, was to get all this information that we professional archaeologists have accumulated for decades out to the public who pays for us to do our work, you know. It should be trickling down to everybody, and not just our students, not just our colleagues. And so that was the goal of my book, to just sort of summarize my career here at ASU and all the projects I've done with my field schools in the summertime. And most of the time those works end up being just technical reports that I send off to the Office of State Archaeology, or maybe the library, ASU library, will get a copy. And that's kind of sinful, you know, so that was my goal here. And I tried to write this book so that anybody could understand it and appreciate it, not just for colleagues. In fact, my colleagues probably consider this, I don't know, not really highly professional writing, but you know, that's not what I wanted to do with this book. And so I feel really great that people have invited me to give these talks to summarize this. And that's what I've done in this year and last year, give kind of overviews of the book. Today I'm going to diverge from that a little bit, because after writing this book, I've gotten calls from friends and people from the public saying, hey, you know, I read your book and I want to tell you about this site that I found and that site that I found. And whoa, that kind of feedback is so wonderful for the professional archaeologist to find out what other people are seeing and finding and thinking. And in fact, in this talk, I'm going to highlight a particular site that I've named the Edwards Cupule site. And I'll explain that in a bit. But also talk a little bit about my book. And if you've read my book, you should realize that it really is all about ancient tourism. Most humans in the past, around the world and in our area, all the way up until fairly recent times, like maybe only 1,000 years ago, which is recent times, most humans were hunters and gatherers. We anthropologists have evidence that our species, Homo sapiens, has existed for nearly 300,000 years. And people began to settle down and live in one place, like in villages and towns, only as recently, maybe as 10,000 years ago, the very end of the Ice Age. So you can do the math, that's a tiny, tiny percentage of our history. So for most of the past, humans have been tourists in a sense, migratory hunters and gatherers moving from place to place. And it depends on your latitude and your altitude, but around here, that would have been a lot of kind of oscillation, seasonal movements between the lowlands and the uplands. Okay, when do the Floridians come to Boone? And when do they leave? Okay, they're smart. And now that I'm entering my retirement, that's going to happen after this semester, you know, I'm starting to think about that Florida house myself. But no, I'll probably stay here on my little farm. But I might be a little more migratory than I am right now. And but of course, in the ancient past, when people didn't have shipping and trucking and freezers and storage and so on, they had to move with changes in the seasons so that they could secure food during any time of the year. So that's why this talk is called Ancient Tourism, and I think my book illustrates that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that fact in my talk today. And I photoshopped this. I had to put this DeSoto in here because he was the first Floridian, sort of, to come to the high country in 1540, right? In fact, he was probably somewhere not too far from here, maybe down around Elk Park. And on my birthday, May 26th, but a lot earlier, 1540. And the chroniclers, I have this 3-volume set of the DeSoto Chronicles, and one of them says that we were freezing. May 26th, they were very cold. That was during something called the Little Ice Age, which wasn't really an ice age, with glacial advances, but the average annual temperatures were quite a little bit lower than they are today. And so they were very cold on May 26th in 1540 when they came through. And by the way, and I'll repeat this in my talk, they didn't encounter any humans when they were in the uplands. There was nobody here then. Well, probably the human story of northwestern North Carolina begins around 10,000 years ago at the very end of the Ice Age, when the environment of this area was quite different and people first began to explore the uplands. Now, there were humans in eastern North America at least 18,000 years ago, but the sites that we have that date to that period are on the coastal plain. And some of them are probably submerged under the water because of sea level rise. When the glaciers melted, the continental glaciers, sea levels were some 300 feet lower during the Ice Age than they are now. So when you look at a map and you see that light blue continental shelf off of the coast of North Carolina that goes out some 50 miles, that was dry land. And people were out there hunting mammoths and mastodons and rabbits and little birds and things like that. The earliest evidence, though, that we have here in the mountains of humans comes in the form of these kinds of spear points, which we call Clovis points or fluted spear points. Fluted because they have this really nice long flake that was detached from the base to make it very thin on the face to facilitate the hafting of the spear point in the shaft. And sometimes these things are this long. This one has been worn out, resharpened, worn out, resharpened, worn out, resharpened, so it was only about this long. But a friend of mine found this along the South Fork of the New River off of Roby Green Road back in the 1980s and donated it to the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians very recently for their museum. So we do find these kinds of tools in the mountains indicating possibly human presence here 10,000 years ago. But we also have to consider that, somebody only 1,000 years ago might have found this tool down around Wilkesboro and went, hey, I can use that, migrated up into the mountains, and then left it up here. So when we find a singular artifact like this, we don't go, aha, people were here 10,000 years ago. But we found several of these, so there's a good possibility that they were coming up here. Even at the end of the Ice Age, when Boone might have looked like this. Maybe the mountain's not so tall and ragged, but it was boreal forest up here 10,000 years ago. Or 10,000 BC, 12,000 years ago. And the rivers might have been, and creeks dammed up by giant beaver. There were beavers the size of Volkswagen bugs in the mountains here at that time. They're extinct now, thank goodness. Wouldn't want to hit one of those with my Volkswagen bug. And there were very different animals roaming the mountains here then. I mean, of course, our white-tailed deer and our raccoons and our turkeys, but also things like mastodons, giant ground sloths. We haven't found the skeletal remains of those in the Boone area, but over in eastern Tennessee and limestone country where bone preservation is a little bit better, we do find the remains of fauna like this dating to that time. So we know they were in the mountains. But this would not be a place for people to reside year-round. Not then, and not even in more recent times. Now, everybody knows, everybody who lives here knows that this place is very special for many reasons, but one of them is that the headwaters of so many rivers come together right here in Boone. And the rivers in ancient times were the highways. People traveled along the river courses because the rivers had etched down the mountains and created gaps and inroads into the mountains. So we find archaeological evidence all along these rivers and clear evidence that people are migrating along the river courses from the lowlands in the east, on the Piedmont, and the west over in the Valley and Ridge province, coming up the Watauga River course into the mountains, especially during summer and especially during the fall. So this was the beginning of the highway systems that we have now. And if I was to just plop on a map of roads, you would see how many of our roads, like 321 coming up from Lenore and 321 coming in from Tennessee, follow these rivers roughly. Of course, with heavy machinery, we've been able to straighten out those roads, but the earlier wagon trails and so on went right along the rivers, really, and kept crisscrossing them. Well, my book highlights a site called the Gwynn Hayes site. This used to be located between the Boone ABC store and Deerfield Road, where the hospital is. Behind that motel that used to exist there, what was that called? The Longview?
Cardinal.
No, oh, it was the Cardinal Motel, okay. Back in 1994 or 5 or 6 or something, I drove by there and I saw a sign, Ray Howells and Associates were going to develop this property and build some kind of big office complex. Probably medical people would rent out that space. So I asked Ray, whose daughter was an anthropology major, hey, can I go out there with my field school and dig around and see if there might be anything left there? Because it looked to me like one of the only preserved islands of undamaged flat ground in all of Boone. And he said, sure, no problem. So I walked out there first and found a little bit of a pathway where there was some erosion, and instantly found flint flakes, quartz flakes. And then my field school did some work out there for 2 or 3 summers, and we found amazing things preserved there. And what was so amazing, well, not that it was there, but when I looked at earlier maps of the region, there were like 4 houses on that property that were torn down, I think, in the 1970s. But even with that, there was still ancient archaeological evidence there. And this site is, the artifacts from this site are what's featured in the display in the library here. So if you haven't seen that, you can go see some of the actual artifacts. So we did our typical field archaeology stuff, teaching the kids how to dig and pedestal things. And we found the remains of hearths, fireplaces, lots of stone tools, some dating back to probably around 11,000 years ago. And it was this deep below the ground.
Oh.
We peeled back the sod with our trowels because we wanted to keep the sod to put back on our excavation units after we backfilled. Peeled back the sod, and right under the sod we found quartz flakes and broken quartz spear points. And typologically, we know that those spear points date to 7,500 years ago. So people were running around in the yards playing badminton, and their dogs were running around, and it's like right under the grass there. There's a myth among the non-professional community that to find the really old stuff, you got to dig way down deep, and that's not true. The earth isn't getting fatter over time. You know, it depends on where you are. If you're on a floodplain next to a river, yeah, you might have deeply buried archaeological evidence because of periodic flood deposition, or maybe next to an active volcano. But most of the time, people camped out on high, dry ground that was not inflating, but actually deflating over time from erosion, so that they could see the valleys around them and watch the movements of game and threatening humans and threatening game, and also not get flooded when they're camping in the middle of the night. And so that's what this place is. If you go stand there, next time you go to the liquor store, just stand there in the parking lot and imagine all the buildings gone from Boone and all the pavement, and you'll realize this is a nice place. And it's one of the first nice places for camping that people would have found, especially if they were coming up from the east, up through what is now Blowing Rock, or up through Deep Gap, maybe. But this is, in the Boone Valley, one of the places that people would have chosen for camping out. And they did. And we found the evidence. So we found, well, this piece of a corner of a spear point, And we didn't date it directly, but they have been found on sites where we have found things that can be dated. Like carbon-14 dating requires something organic. So if we have a fireplace with some charcoal or bone or something, we can date that, and if it's next to these things, we know that these kinds of spear points date to that time period. So this thing and this big core scraper date to about 11,000 years ago. And I think people actually came here then. And what's really cool is that they're made out of materials, this is called vitric tuff, so is this, that originate on the Piedmont down around Asheboro, North Carolina. Okay. So not only can we say, okay, we've got tourists coming to the mountains, we know from where they're coming. And we can reconstruct the distance of their migration patterns based on the kinds of rocks that their tools are made of. And these guys date to about 8,000 years ago. And these guys date to about 7,500 years ago. And this stuff here dates to about between 5 and 3,000 years ago. So what's happening here is that people are migrating seasonally, probably in the fall, because that's when the deer are fat, furry, antlered, and stupid. That's why we have our hunting season in the fall. Turkeys are all over the place eating the nuts that are falling from the trees. The nuts themselves, especially the chestnuts, this is the best grocery store in the world, or at least was before the chestnuts disappeared, in the fall, right? And that's probably, or late summer, early fall, would have been the best time for humans to come here. And so they're making paths in the process. They're using those paths over and over again to come into the mountains. And they probably had a name for this site. I call it the Gwynn Hay site because that's the name of the guy that owned the property originally. But they probably had a name for it too. And they probably were like, well, it's time to go to the da-da-da-da site because that's a great place because there's all that food up there at this time of year and we know where it is. And I mean, even the artifacts that they're depositing in the ground are kind of there to be scavenged and reused. And the fireplaces are revived and reused over and over again. And so, so they're becoming sort of, these migratory hunters and gatherers are becoming tethered to these places. These are their hubs. And this ensures too that the pathways that they're making become their highways that can be used over and over and over again. Well, so maybe this is what it might have looked like. I drew this actually for a different site in Tennessee, but it kind of applies here as well. If you can imagine just, you know, a few families together building temporary shelters because they're only going to live there for a month, exploit all the resources within a walking radius, and then move on to another location. But that, you know, I almost felt like when I was writing my book that, well, this is kind of boring because they're doing the same thing 8,000 years ago that they did 10,000 years ago and 6,000, you know, it's the same old story. I kept trying to make it more interesting, but really this way of life existed in this region I mean, with minor changes in tools and stuff from the beginning of human activity up here, maybe 12,000 years ago, all the way up to maybe about 1,000 years ago. So for 8, 9, 10,000 years, same old, you know. All right, so one thing that reason I wanted to write this book was because, you know, so many people think that, well, life began here with Daniel Boone. No, I mean, what a rich past this place has, and it's just kind of invisible. It's not really made aware to people. So that was one of the purposes of the book too. But like I said at the beginning, in giving these talks and in writing this book, people started coming to me and telling me about stuff. And so instead of giving the same talk that I've given 5 times since I published this book, I'm going to interject here a new story based on that fact that I'm getting some great feedback from the public. I've had a friend for 20 years, Bernie Edwards. I don't know if you know Bernie and Sandra Edwards, but Bernie read my book, and he's known me for a long time, but it wasn't until he read my book that he goes, Tom, I got this site I think you need to check out. Bernie's from Georgia, and he's got a great Georgia accent. He goes, back in 1975, when I owned this property, I was camping out, or I was picnicking with the kids on this big boulder, Bernie's house is way off through the woods there. And he said, we found these carvings on this rock. You might want to come out and look at it. And, you know, usually when that happens, you know, I go out there and it's just natural, you know, or it's really cool something. So I went out to look at the rock, and I realized that it was a really soft rock. In fact, archaeologists call this stuff soapstone, but actually it's my geologist said, no, it's not soapstone, it's anthophylitic schist. Yeah, and if I say that word 5 times, I might stumble and say a bad word, so I'll probably just call it soapstone in my talk. The geologists have a really funny joke. They say it's what is it? It's not soapstone. It's really nice GNEISS schist, SCHIST. So don't take it for granted.
Right.
Or something. All right. So I went to the site. I looked at the rock. I said, okay, this is soapstone-y kinds of stuff, and I didn't see any carvings on it. But I thought, well, I'm intrigued about that soapstone. And also out here in Lee Jones's yard, I found a couple of stone artifacts just laying on the surface. And wonderfully, I ended up having to teach the field school this past summer during the pandemic, which was not fun, arranging it, but once we were out there it was fun. But I wasn't supposed to teach the field school, but my colleague who was supposed to teach it just instantly retired for some reason. So we had all these students that had to have this to graduate, so I agreed to teach the field school. And you know, usually I plan ahead and know exactly where I'm going to be, but this time I didn't have a plan. But thank goodness Bernie said, hey, you ought to come out here. And Lee Jones and Mark Timchuk, who own this property line goes right down the middle, they were fine about us having our field school there. So it worked out, and we had fun, and I learned a lot. So anyway, here's the boulder. And we concentrated our excavation efforts in this region. That's just kind of like a little spine. I mean, it's just a tiny hump on the landform. There's a nice creek over here, so there's a water source. It's off the Hopewell Church Road, northern Watauga County, so only about 8 miles from here, very convenient. And you know, it's not Boone, but it tells a similar story to the kinds of sites we find in Boone, so it fits into this talk, I suppose. And I'm standing on the boulder looking north here out into this big field, and determined that this giant boulder of anthophylitic schist probably had detached from higher up on this mountain during the Ice Age and rolled down here. It's not a bedrock, in other words. But we did, on top of this boulder, after clearing the lichen and the moss off of it, we did find some things. We call these cupules, or sometimes it's pronounced cupules, but a British friend of mine corrected me. He says, no, they're cupules. Okay. Because the word actually comes from a biological term. You know the little fairy caps that we call them that come off of acorns? Yeah. Those are cupules. Oh. So I think that's where it comes from. But so these little divots, these little circular marks here, are not natural. They're definitely human-made. And there's a cluster of them on top of this boulder. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. Here's another shot of them. I filled them with water in this case so they kind of show up. And here's a map of them. And no matter how much I smoke, I can't turn this into any kind of a pattern or what I smoke. But sometimes we find them in very distinctive patterns. Mimicking constellations or asterisms or animal forms. And they're found all over the world, and some of them in India date back to 200,000 years ago. So it's a common human symbol motif. I don't want to call it art, it might not be art, but it obviously symbolizes something, either the cupules themselves or the making of them or something. But we'll get to that in a minute. And then I made Sculpey impressions. Sculpey is this wonderful polymer clay that my kids used to play with. So you can squish it in there, and then you can fire it in your own oven at 275. And so here's you can start this side, and maybe you can go that way and then come back to me this way. Made impressions of the cupules just to preserve that evidence and to have things to measure. And And some of them are deeper than others, some of them are kind of pointed, some of them are rounded, and we've done experiments to try to replicate these. And here's an overall view of the boulder itself. And this is as big as this room. This is the main cupule cluster, and there's an outlier up there, and there are a few other little interesting features on this phospholite schist. And then we set up our datum point here for map reference and set up a little grid. And just to test the site, because we want to preserve most of this site for the future, for future archaeological research when maybe better methods and techniques are available. So we just wanted to learn what we could learn about the site from limited excavation. And so we excavated 1 by 1 meter squares along this line, every other square. So a total of 6 units, perfect for a field school of 11 students plus me. So here's looking kind of north back towards the field with my students working. Excavated by trowels, and we excavated in little levels, 5 centimeter levels, so that we could see if there's any changes in artifact types as we go down. We've excavated around a lot of roots, and it was very, very, very good for the students to learn how tedious this can be and how to deal with that. And screened all the soil through 1/4 inch mesh screen, except for, we did find one hearth feature where we saved all that soil for finer processing through actually window screen. So here's our excavation units looking back at the boulder. And here are some of the artifacts that we found. Almost identical to what we found at the Gwen Hayes site. I mean, you guys can see that, right? Very similar kinds of things. But there's 2 big clusters of dates represented here. This top row of stuff dates to probably around 3,000 years ago, YBP, years before present. Actually, everything in this slide dates to about that time period. So we have the remains of a stone knife made out of quartzite from eastern Tennessee. Some knives made out of rhyolite from the Piedmont of North Carolina. Arrow points made out of flint, quartz, jasper, and rhyolite. Okay, quartz might be a local material, but it also could have been imported quartz. So we have arrow points, knives, dating to about 3,000 years ago. Most of the stuff that we can typologically date, is like the same as you guys seeing like a 1965 Mustang going down the road. It doesn't say 1965 on it, but you know from comparative evidence that that's what that dates to, right? Or if you're like me and you find one of those aluminum pull tabs, and you go, I remember doing that in college. That's 1970. Yeah. And then we found a lesser amount of material dating to between maybe about 1,500 years ago, so 500 AD, on up to about 700 years ago, or 1300-ish AD, okay? So 2 clusters of materials indicating that the site was most often used in those 2 time periods, but possibly other time periods as well. We could go out there and dig another square and maybe find a 10,000-year-old artifact, I don't know. But definitely 2 main clusters of time periods. And I don't mean that it was occupied twice. I mean that probably around 3,000 years ago, people were visiting that site every fall, for a long time, for maybe 100, 200 years. And maybe the same thing with this more recent time. And these kinds of tools, indicate somewhat the activities that took place on the site. Now, a lot of my artifact collector buddies go, yeah, I've got an Indian battlefield here because I've got all these arrow points and spear points. But actually, no, probably people are just camping out and they're retooling at night. These things are actually worn out and broken and recycled down to nothing. And so they're retooling, they're throwing away their old, broken, worn out tools and putting in new ones while they're sitting around the campfire in most cases. And that's why these kinds of things accumulate there. But probably, yeah, they're foraging out on a daily basis and hunting and using these tools. So it was probably just a seasonal base camp for hunting and gathering. You know, maybe in the typical sexist scenario, the men are going out and hunting on a daily basis and coming back with nothing, and the women and the children are going out and foraging for roots and mushrooms and berries and turtles and snakes on a daily basis and coming back with most of the food, right? And then we found some tools that looked like they might have actually been used to shape the soapstone, the anthophyllite schist, like this quartz pick. It's about that big. And this thing that probably had a handle on it because of the way it's got a constricted base here, made out of Piedmont materials. And sort of the use wear on these things looked like they were actually working something very coarse, like soft stone. Maybe these were used to make the cupules, or maybe something from the soapstone itself. And then one really cool, odd artifact we find that we almost never find on archaeological sites. These are so rare. We don't even know what they are, but this is a slate object. The scale's kind of hard to see, but it's about this long. And it's clearly broken. It would have extended this way, and it's very thin. And it's made of a green banded slate that we think actually originated in Ohio. And we don't know what it was. Okay. Now these are things that Bernie and his grandchildren found because they were kind of using grubbing hose around the boulder back in 1975. And they found these things that are very, very round. This is a round quartzite cobble, very smooth. And there's no quartzite there on the site geologically. So this was imported, and it has a little bit of a metallic sort of sheen in the grains of the material that looks a lot like the dust from the soapstone boulder. So it might have been used to process, to make cupules or to shape something from the soapstone. And then this rounded, smooth, fire-reddened pebble, I'm guessing that it might have been used as a pottery smoothing tool. We know that native potters in this region would take small pebbles and use them to smooth out the insides of vessels especially. In fact, M.R. Harrington, who worked for the Smithsonian Institution, observed and photographed the last of the Cherokee potters around 1900 down around Cherokee. And one potter, Iwi Catalsta, had a little quartz pebble that she used for smoothing, and she told him, "This was my great-great-great-grandmother's pottery smoothing tool." So these were heirloomed, curated items too. That's a guess, I'm not sure. All right, and we did find some soapstone vessel fragments. I brought in not this one that you've seen coming out of the ground here, but this is part of that same vessel. We can pass this around. Try not to scratch it with your fingernails, but this is a preform. This was never finished. It broke in manufacture. It's very thin and clunky, but it's got the rim here, and you can see the scratch marks on it. So it was never finished. So that was a production failure. This is proof that Native Americans said bad words, because it probably took days for them to get to that point, and it broke. It broke along a little seam. You can see a kind of iron staining in the seam of the material. So we did find some of this, and it is the same material that the boulder is made of. So possibly one reason for occupying that site was to make soapstone vessels that in our area predate barely, but also overlap in date with clay pottery. So soapstone vessel manufacture was common in this region, and there's lots of soapstone in this region, especially up around Jefferson. There used to be a commercial quarry up there in historic times, and before that it was a Native American quarry. Soapstone is such a nice soft rock, and you can throw it in a fire, and because it's an igneous rock, it won't crack or break from the heat, so it's ideal for cooking. And soapstone vessels were made here between 3,700 years ago all the way up to probably about 2,500 years ago, which overlaps with the dates of this site. And so this kind of could have predated pottery, or could have been used at the same time that clay pottery was being used. And that the earliest dates on clay pottery that we have in the mountains are right around 3,000, right around 3,000 years ago. Yeah. So 1,000 BC. And we did find some pottery too, clay pottery, some small pieces. And just like the stone tools, these cluster in two big age brackets. This stuff up here on the top row, that is cord marked. You can see the cord marks here on the exterior, or fabric marked. Sometimes we call this like a wicker fabric, where you have the, I always forget what's the weft and the warp, but cords wrapped around cords to create a fabric. Dates to, where's my button? Not working. Work button. Here it is. About 3,000 years before present, so about the same time as a lot of the stone tools. And then we have this net marked pottery, and net or fabric marked pottery, which we know from getting actual dates on the pottery using optically stimulated luminescence dating. Dates to around 1300 or 1350 AD. So 2 clusters of pottery, just like the stone artifacts. So this indicates, that there's other things going on at this site too. A lot of food processing, probably, and maybe even pottery manufacture. Okay, only the old people in the room get this joke. Okay. Mr. Peabody, let's use the Wayback Machine and go back to 1000 AD. Okay, Simon. All right. Now, around 900 to 1000 AD, somewhere in that ballpark, paleoclimatologists have reconstructed temperature from tree ring data, from oxygen isotope, from sea core data, and so on. And we know that in the temperate latitudes of the world and in North America, there's this warming trend called the medieval warm period. And it's historically documented by writing in Europe. That's when we see the first evidence of people actually settling down up here in the higher elevations, above 2,500 feet. Now, it happened much earlier in the lowlands, people forming villages and farming maize and so on. But in the uplands here, it's migratory hunters and gatherers all the way up to close to 1000 AD here, when the medieval warm period happened. And I think that that's not a coincidence. That's when it was possible for maize farmers, and that was the primary crop of southeastern Indians in pre-contact times, to actually have a successful harvest. Before then, it wasn't really possible because the forms of maize they had were not the kind that we have today. They required several months of growth and development to produce, food. And then it was short-lived, okay, so around 1350, 1400, the Little Ice Age, a dip in temperatures, a dramatic dip in temperatures came about, and that probably, they probably had 2 or 3 bad years in a row, and they just couldn't sustain village life up here and had to get out, because by that point they're dependent on maize horticulture for their, at least supplementary, for their foodways and so on. So it's in this time bracket that we start to see village life in the mountains. Not before, and actually not after, until Euro-Americans came. And one of the examples of that is the Ward site down on the Watauga River, where Cove Creek comes into Watauga River. And ASU archaeologists, way back before my time, did this work and uncovered post molds of the village wall and post molds of circular houses with central fireplaces. Okay, so this is a permanent village, and it dates to about 11 or 1200 AD, right smack in the middle of that medieval warm period, when it was possible for people to do this. And this is some of the pottery from the Ward site, and it's not dissimilar from, these are the rim sherds, not dissimilar from what we found at the Edwards Cupule site, the later pottery. It's got fabric marking and net marking on the bodies. You can't see that on these. And we actually did find some rim sherds with these punctations in them at the Edwards Cupule site as well. So what I'm thinking is that maybe that site, Edwards Cupule site, in the later component, when it was occupied in more recent pre-contact times, say around 700 to 1,000 years ago, there might have been a village nearby, like maybe in that big field just north of the site, along the major creek there. It's called Riddle Creek. And maybe people were actually just leaving some artifacts near the boulder because they were performing some kind of activities there, I'm not sure, related to that. All right, but going back to the cupule site, the big questions are, okay, why are these things on this rock? Why did people come to this place in the past? What was so attractive about it? You know, it's really a very unassuming little spot on the landscape. You know, if I was out in that area looking for a place to camp, I probably wouldn't have chosen that spot, really. I mean, there are better places nearby, I think. The boulder's kind of cool, of course. Maybe they were using the material from the boulder for making pottery. We did find this one blob, it says like this big, okay, of unfired or poorly fired clay. It's got a lot of sand in it, but it's mostly clay. And it's got a chunk of the soapstone, the anthophyllite in it. And so it looks like they were, and some of the pottery shards do too. So it appears that they were sometimes crushing up the anthophyllite schist and mixing it with clay as a temper to control for shrinkage in the firing process. So maybe that was one reason that they were there. Maybe the cupules, I mean, this is kind of a wild hypothesis, but maybe they were pecking those places in one spot so that the dust and the crumbs from the anthophyllite could accumulate in this little naturally forming bowl that they're making, scoop it up, mix it with their clay, and make pottery. It's not unreasonable. It's kind of a little bit out there. Because, you know, why wouldn't they just take chunks of it and just smash it on a rock or, I don't know. Maybe they were there to obtain the material for making these vessels. But usually at soapstone quarry sites, we see the very clear scars from this. Like up near Jefferson, there are some sites, and around Atlanta, Georgia, and Yancey County, North Carolina, there's some soapstone quarry sites. And we see these scars where they would isolate a promontory, a nodule of the soapstone, sort of by hacking and chiseling a channel around that nodule and making sort of a mushroom shape, and then they'd break it off, and then this is sort of the neck or the stem from where it broke off, and then they'd have that preform, that block to shape into a vessel. We don't see that at this site. None of these. We looked so carefully. That's not there. Maybe they were, because the cupules resulted from nut cracking. This is one hypothesis that has been offered, that these are just big nutting stones. You know, they're taking their harvest up there, the nuts that they've gathered, and they're just pounding the nuts, and either they made these pits to hold the nut meat so that it wouldn't scatter while they were pounding them, or maybe the pits actually resulted from the pounding of the nuts. You know, if you pound 6 million walnuts in one spot on a soft rock, you might end up with a cupule, right? But I've done experiments, and I find it much better to take a smaller rock and put it in a basket and pound your nuts, and all the stuff accumulates in the basket. And we know that from ethnohistoric accounts that native peoples did that too, so why not? I don't know, I don't like the nut cracking hypothesis. We've done, my students and I have a class I teach in the fall called Experimental Archaeology, and last fall, many of my students chose as their experiment replicating cupules in various kinds of rocks using different techniques. And to make those nice rounded cupules like this cast of one here, the most effective way is to take a quartz or quartzite chunk of rock with a point on it and just go bam, bam, bam in one spot for, you know, like 20 minutes, and you end up with a perfectly hemispherical cupule when you do that. You can almost not avoid having that. Here's one made in a hard sandstone with this pick right here. Some of the ones that are found around the world, we know from ethnohistorical documentation, eyewitness accounts, that they're actually what we call bedrock mortars for pounding nuts or maize, but especially nuts. So this has been observed especially in California and other places. But these tend to be very large and very deep, and not in extremely soft rock either. I think that if this was what was going on here, if this was being done with a big pestle like this, we'd end up with much larger cupules and much deeper ones. So that's not a very good match either. Sometimes the cupules are found, not on flat surfaces, but on the sides of rocks. That wouldn't be very good for nut processing. This is one from, I think, England. Here's one from France. And sometimes they occur with other kinds of glyphs or features, troughs and so forth. So here we've got two things up here that look like they could be mortars, but then what about all this other stuff? Here's one. Oh, speaking of giving talks, I gave a talk one time at New River State Park, and I was talking about rock art and so on, and this guy comes up to me after the talk and he goes, "I got something you need to see." And he sent me this picture, and I went, "I need to see that." This is where Cranberry Creek flows into the South Fork of the New River, just downstream from New River State Park. These are cupules. These were made by people. This is not natural, okay? And some of these are on a slope like this. There's something else going on here besides function. There's something ritual or symbolic about these cupules, in this case especially. And they're often found in western North Carolina, by the way, along rivers, and sometimes even on rocks in the middle of the river, especially in the Hiwassee River, southwestern North Carolina. There are dozens and dozens of these. And they're also typically found along pathways. Well, here's a rock with some cupules in it. These are smaller, about the size of a golf ball, that was on my shelf when I inherited the lab in 1989. We have no idea where it came from. It had no writing on it, no nothing. I think probably an artifact collector might have donated it, and that's why it didn't have any provenience. But the rock is the kind you'd expect from around here. It's, I forget what it's called, but it's a really long word. And it was sitting on my shelf, and I just would look at this thing all the time. And archaeologists call it, this is the size of a toaster. Archaeologists call these nutting stones. That's a bad word. That's not science. That's a good hypothesis, but that's only one hypothesis, right? There are many alternative explanations for these pits in this rock. And I was staring at it one day and I went, man, that looks like the Pleiades. You know that tiny asterism that's in the winter sky that was so sacred to humans all around the world, especially Native Americans. The rising of the Pleiades in the fall indicated it was time for harvest. The setting of the Pleiades in the spring indicated it was time for planting. And there are myths all around the world in North America, South America, Greece, Rome, about the Pleiades forming by dancers getting called up and sucked up into the sky and turning into the stars. I think that myth, that story goes back 100,000 years, and has evolved and changed. But anyway, so I'm staring at this thing and I went, wow, look at that. The Pleiades. Yeah. And I took it over to Richard Gray, astronomer at ASU, who's also dabbles in archaeology, by the way. He's into archaeoastronomy. He goes, that's definitely the Pleiades. So, maybe it was a nutting stone, okay, but there was something else about that. Anyway. Okay, I'm about to wrap this up about why these cupules, what were people doing at this site. Here's Jodocala Rock, one of the most famous petroglyph in North Carolina. This is in Jackson County, North Carolina, southwestern North Carolina. Jodocala Rock has been studied by so many people and so many interpretations of what this all means. You've got footprints and various human figures and gazillions of cupules and various kinds of lines here and there. And even after this was formed, before all this was on here, it was a place that people got soapstone for making vessels, because this is soapstone, and there's two of the vessels preformed scars there. So this is a very sacred thing for the Cherokee Indians, and probably was for their predecessors. And I don't know who to agree with about what it represents. But one thing that is certain is that these rocks with cupules on them in our western mountains most often show up along trails. Well, it just so happens that about 500 feet from the boulder that we found and worked next to was the intersection of Hopewell Church Road and Old Buffalo Trail. And this wasn't just some sign that somebody stuck up, or somebody didn't name it that because they thought that was cute. Okay, there actually is a major trail connecting the headwaters of the Yadkin River with the headwaters of the Tennessee River going through the mountains of northern Watauga County. A big trail, okay, that people think is a buffalo trail. There's still signs, I think, buffalo trail crossings up there near Todd and so on. Well, that's interesting to me because I'm a zooarchaeologist. I study animal bones from archaeological sites. No buffalo, and there's no such thing as a buffalo in the Americas, it's bison. No bison bones have been found in North Carolina, ever. And I've analyzed millions of bones from hundreds of archaeological sites. Never, okay? Back in the 60s, they thought they found some at Garden Creek Mound #1 in Haywood County, North Carolina. These really massive vertebrae and stuff. And Joffrey Coe at Chapel Hill said, buffalo bones. But I've actually got those recently and looked at them. They're elk bones. They're not buffalo bones. So why is this called a buffalo trail? Well, I think that when Europeans first started coming to these mountains, like Spangenberg, Bishop August Spangenberg, the Moravian who came up here in 1751, and I don't know what he was thinking coming up in December 3rd, 1751. Of course, some of the vegetation's down. It might be easier if you're on horses to travel through these mountains, but for the most part, he was on trails that somebody else had made, buffalo, whatever. When De Soto came through in 1540 with 600 men, 300 horses, and a herd of pigs and his mastiffs, they weren't crawling through the woods. They were on trails that had already existed. And I think that maybe somebody in the later 1700s, maybe around Daniel Boone's time, witnessed some bison on these trails because the bison had started migrating into the mountains after 1750 from the west into the east. After 1750. They didn't make these trails, they used them. Okay, and somebody saw a bison on one and said, Buffalo Trails. So now we've got all these places called Buffalo Creek, Buffalo Mountain, Buffalo, whatever. So they're not buffalo trails. Those trails were created by humans for over 10,000 years, migrating into the mountains and out of the mountains, probably. And maybe other kinds of game were using them, of course. But. Okay, so when Spangenberg came up here in 1751, he saw nobody, no people. Down off the mountain, maybe around what is now the Globe area, he describes a place called Indian Old Fields. Well, we don't know if he saw some corn stubble or found a couple of pieces of pottery. There's no explanation of that. But he didn't see people. And the reason is because this is the Little Ice Age. People were not here except for possibly still coming up during the warmer late summer, fall months to camp out and avail themselves of all the wonderful resources here, and then getting out into the lowlands before winter sets in. So I'm going to wrap this up then by dispelling another myth, and that is that this is Cherokee territory. John Royce, who was commissioned by the federal government back in 1884 to make a map of Indian territories, he included our area right there as Cherokee territory, because how did he come up with this? Basically, he interviewed the Cherokees, and he said, okay, well, what used to be all your land? Well, of course, the Cherokee said, well, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina. But, and when I came here and everybody said, I'm descended from a Cherokee, whatever, I said, "Oh, that's interesting, and this is Cherokee territory." I believed that. But in my 33 years of working in this area, I have not found one artifact in northwestern North Carolina, okay, like north of Burnsville and the Tow River area, not one artifact that I can identify or link with the Cherokee. And their pottery, and even their pre-contact, prehistoric pottery, is very distinctive. Koala pottery, the markings on it, the style, the way it's made, you can't mistake it for anything. We don't find koala pottery up here. In fact, the pottery that I showed you from our Edwards Cupule site and from the Ward site that dates to around 1100, 1200, 1300 AD, during that medieval warm period, the way it's made is much, much, much more similar to the pottery that we find of the same time period down on the Piedmont, around Wilkesboro and Lenore and Happy Valley area. And that place, in historic times, early historic times, was occupied by Siouan-speaking peoples. Okay, the Cherokee speak an Iroquoian language. The Catawbas are this group that formed out of the dregs, the leftovers of decimated tribes of Siouan-speaking peoples that lived on the Piedmont. Okay, so I think if anybody could claim this region, at least in terms of their deep heritage, it would be the Catawbas and their related peoples, not the Cherokees. And the Cherokees and the Catawbas were mortal enemies in ancient times. So the reason I bring this up too is that there's all this movement going on now called the land acknowledgement. ASU is doing this, various departments are doing this, lots of agencies are doing this, and it's a beautiful, wonderful thing to do, to acknowledge that, the imperial Euro-Americans took over this place and stole it from the native peoples, and acknowledge that fact and say, we respect the fact that this was the traditional lands of these people. Well, here in the northern counties, there's a tendency to say that, to acknowledge the Cherokees. And I think that's a very nice gesture, but we should probably not just acknowledge the Cherokees, maybe also, and other native groups who don't even exist anymore, because we killed them off with disease or outright with warfare. Or the Catawbas, whose ancestors might also lay claim to this area, because this was a place that was used by lots of people. People come from the east and the west throughout the whole Holocene post-Ice Age epoch. I'd like to thank Bernie and Sandra Edwards, especially for alerting me to the presence of that site and giving me all kinds of important information, and also for letting us use Bernie's shop bathroom. 11 ASU students during the pandemic. That was heroic. And Lee and Maria Jones and Mark Chimshuk, the owners of the site. Thank you very much for listening to me. Are there any questions I could field? Or try to? Yes?
Did they travel in canoes or watch the rivers?
Probably where it could be done, but once you get up here pretty far up into the mountains, there would have been a lot of portaging of canoes. And the canoes that the native peoples had in this area were dugout canoes made out of trunks of trees, and hauling those up the rapids and around the corner of the waterfall would have been probably not a good idea. So I would imagine that their canoes would have been used especially to get as far as they could, but then they probably would have hid them in the woods and just traveled on foot after that. That's just, I'm guessing based on the fact that those things weigh a ton,
This is a personal question. Now that you have mentioned that you're looking forward to the horizons of the new journey of retirement at the end of the semester, how does it feel as an archaeologist driving around this area as much as you have and realizing there's so much that has been buried and covered. I remember once in one of your lectures, you mentioned that there was a whole bunch of stuff under the tennis courts at ASU. How does that feel? Because I would think as an archaeologist, it's so exciting, the world of archaeology, and I know you've been doing it for a long time, but just to put all the pieces together in your mind, and the A corresponds with B, corresponds with C, this wonderful world of unknown knowledge, but known knowledge, but mixing of knowledge. How does it feel to drive around and realize so much building is going on and so much sites could be destroyed from all this, whatever, I don't even want to even go there, I don't know what word to use. How does that feel, as opposed to looking at this beautiful topography that was here so long ago?
You know, it's funny that I felt that this morning. I was driving, I live out near the old Cove Creek School, and I was coming up 321 through Vilas. I looked over to the left and I saw a newly bulldozed area, and I went, oh, there goes another one.
Yeah.
Because there was a site there.
Right.
And it's, you know, private construction, and so it happens on a daily basis. And back in the early days of my career, I was like, this is tragic, and I would like try to find landowners and desperately try to get volunteers out there, like the Hayes site, you know, but over the years, it's just like anything. I mean, when I see the trash on the side of the road,
Oh, I
just
know.
like, it used to just make me sick, and now I'm like, you do what you can, you get used to it, and also at our age, you can't stress yourself out about stuff like that, you know, because we want to live as long as we can, and stress is not conducive to a long, healthy life. So I just try to take a deep breath and go, you know, we're learning what we can, and there are still some sites out there, and amazing new discoveries still happen, and keep on the bright side of life. So yeah, it's still.
Is the Ward site, where that double silo is on top of a mid, somebody said that there was a double silo at the Ward farm?
It's I don't remember a double silo, but it's where Ray Ward built this major bank barn, a giant red barn into a bank. There, where Cove Creek comes into
Right.
the Chaga. So that whole floodplain there, where he farms, is where that is. Yeah.
I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed the anecdotes and your drawing too. I didn't know that you brought all that to the table, and so you might consider some writing and drawing in retirement.
Yeah, I'm working on a fiction novel, and I want to get back into my art, but especially photography. That was my number one love. But I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree.
It's a wonderful drawing, the one you're drawing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I started out as an art major, and I took a field archaeology class in my senior year because my best friend was taking it. And then look what happened.
Yeah. Well,
That's what friends are for.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Yes.
Just a curiosity, when you talked about vessel, were you referring to pottery, or?
Oh, well, I mostly referred to vessels when I was talking about the soapstone stuff,
Okay, yeah.
which isn't pottery,
Yeah,
right? So only the clay would be pottery.
Yeah.
But of course, you can use that word to talk about clay pots too, right? But,
Wonderful.
Thank you.
thank you.